A young pediatric nurse handed back a chart with a denial stamped in red, and she had no idea she'd just refused the air to the most dangerous shipping empire on the East Coast. The fluorescent lights of St. Index Children's Hospital buzzed faintly over the nurse's station, the kind of low hum you stopped noticing after the first year. It was 7:40 on a Wednesday night, and Juniper Vale was still in her scrubs at the end of a double shift, staring at a chart she had read 3 times already. At 29, she had clawed her way through nursing school on loans and double shifts, and she had a rule she never broke. No patient skipped the line because of who was paying. She'd seen what happened when hospitals bent for money. People died quietly in waiting rooms, while someone's son got a private room for a sprained wrist. The chart in front of her belonged to Caleb Hartley Sterling, 19 years old, brought in by 2 men in suits who didn't introduce themselves, complaining of chest pain that, after the EKG and labs came back clean, looked a lot like a panic attack dressed up as an emergency. Behind him, 6 other kids were waiting, a toddler with a fever spiking past 104, a boy with a possibly broken arm, an infant struggling to breathe. Juniper had triaged Caleb appropriately. Stable, wait your turn. He didn't take it well. Do you understand whose name is on this hospital's new cardiac wing? He said. His voice pitched just loud enough for the whole station to hear, his jaw tight with the particular fury of someone who had never once in his life been told to sit down and wait. I understand you're stable, and that baby isn't, Juniper said, not looking up from her tablet. You can sit or you can leave. Those are your options. He left. He didn't yell, didn't threaten. He just stared at her with a coldness that made the hair on her arms rise, then turned and walked out, his 2 silent shadows falling in step behind him. By the time her shift ended, the hospital's chief administrator, Gerald Finch, was waiting for her outside the locker room, sweating through his collar despite the air conditioning. Tell me you didn't turn away the Sterling boy, he said. I triaged him correctly. He's fine. There's a chart, you can read it. Juniper. Finch's voice cracked on her name. Do you have any idea who his father is? Some donor. I don't memorize the plaque names. That's Roman Sterling. Finch said it like the words themselves might summon something. He doesn't just donate to this hospital, Juniper. He built half the Port Authority's private security contracts. People who annoy him don't get sued. They get gone. Juniper felt something cold drop through her stomach, but the same stubbornness that had carried her out of a falling-down apartment in Newark and into a nursing degree held steady in her chest. Then I guess he should teach his son to wait his turn like everyone else's kid. She walked past Finch and out into the parking garage and told herself the matter was closed. It wasn't. The black SUV was waiting at her building when she got home, idling at the curb with its headlights off. 2 men stepped out before she'd even cut her engine, dressed like they belonged at a funeral, polite in the particular way of people who would not hesitate to be impolite if required. Mrs. Vale, the older one said, Mr. Sterling would like to speak with you. It's 9 at night. I worked a double. Whatever this is, it can wait until... It can't. He opened the back door of the SUV like he was holding it for a date instead of an abduction. Please. Juniper looked around the half-empty street at the curtained windows of her own building and understood with a sinking certainty that no one was going to come outside and ask questions. She got in. The drive took almost an hour, out past the city lights and into a stretch of dark coastline where the houses got bigger and the gates got higher until they turned through wrought iron and up a long gravel drive toward a house that looked less like a home and more like something built to withstand a siege, glass, black stone, floodlights, catching the edge of a private dock where 2 boats sat moored like sleeping animals. They led her through the house in silence, past art that looked like it belonged in a museum, until they reached a set of doors at the end of a long hallway. A man opened them and gestured her through without a word. The room beyond smelled like leather and good whiskey and the sea. A man stood at the far window with his back to her, looking out over black water, and when he turned around, Juniper's breath caught somewhere in her throat and refused to come loose. He was nothing like she'd pictured. Mid-40s, maybe, with a face that looked carved rather than aged, dark hair silvering faintly at the temple, a grey suit that fit like a second skin. There was no menace in his posture, nothing loud or theatrical, just a stillness that filled the room anyway, the particular quiet of a man who had never once needed to raise his voice to be obeyed. "Mrs. Vale," his voice was low, unhurried. "Thank you for coming. I wasn't given a choice." Something flickered at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile. He walked to his desk and picked up a printed copy of the triage log, her own handwriting visible on the page. "My son tells me you refused to treat him, that you let him sit in agony while you tended to lesser patients out of some personal grudge against this family." Juniper's exhaustion burned off in an instant, replaced by something sharper. She crossed the room and stopped at the edge of his desk, close enough that the two guards by the door shifted their weight. Roman lifted two fingers, and they went still. "Your son is lying to you, Mr. Sterling." Her voice didn't shake. "He had a panic attack with a clean EKG. I had a baby in respiratory distress and a kid with a broken arm. I treated patients in the order their bodies required, not the order their father's name suggested. If that offends him, he can take it up with his cardiologist, because there's nothing wrong with his heart." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the distant wash of the ocean against the rocks below the house. Then Roman Sterling laughed, low, dry, with no humor in it at all. "I read the chart before you walked in," he said. "I already knew." Juniper blinked. "Then why? Because I wanted to see if you'd hold the line in front of me the way you held it in that hospital." He set the paper down. "Caleb has been protected his entire life. Doctors who clear him for things that don't need clearing. Teachers who pass him. A mother who died when he was 12 and left a hole he's been trying to buy his way out of ever since. Everyone in his orbit is afraid of me, Miss Vale, and so they let him become someone I don't recognize." Something dark and old moved behind his eyes. "I run a company with enemies who would like nothing better than to find a crack in this family and pry it wide open. If my son cannot survive a normal Tuesday in an emergency room, he will not survive what's coming for him in 5 years." Juniper said nothing, because there was nothing prepared in her for this, for the most feared man on the eastern seaboard quietly agreeing with her. "You are the first person in a decade who has told a Sterling no and meant it," Roman said, stepping closer, his gaze dropping briefly to her mouth before returning deliberately to her eyes. "I find that I require more of it. Starting this week, you'll come to this house 3 evenings a week, not as a nurse, as whatever it takes to put a spine back in my son before the world tests him and finds him hollow. I have a job, Mr. Sterling, a real one. People need me at that hospital. I'll pay the hospital for your hours twice over, and I'll make certain you never have to fight Gerald Finch for anything again, as long as you live in this city." His voice dropped, quieter now, almost intimate. "And if you say no?" He didn't move toward her the way she expected. He simply waited, the question sitting between them like something with weight. "Then I say no," Juniper said, "and you let me go home." Something in his expression shifted. Surprise, maybe, or the particular respect of a man unused to being refused twice in one night. "Fine," he said finally, "but you'll think about it." She did think about it every hour, all the way home, and again the next morning when Finch handed her a transfer notice to the hospital's worst rotation, with a smile that told her exactly whose fingerprints were on it. By the end of the week, with 3 patients she'd cared for, moved without explanation and her hours quietly slashed, she understood that refusing Roman Sterling didn't mean the offer disappeared. It meant the walls simply closed in around her until there was only one door left open. She called the number on the card Roman had pressed into her palm before she left that first night, and 3 days later she stood in the same mahogany-paneled study, arms crossed. "I'll teach him to think like a person who's actually been told no," she said. "But I do it my way. No watching me work like I'm some kind of project. No interference." The almost smile returned, sharper this time. "Agreed." The first weeks were a war. Caleb sulked through every session, threw out sarcastic remarks about charity cases and people who needed a paycheck badly enough to babysit a grown man, slid an envelope of cash across the table on day 4, like she might simply take it and disappear. Juniper picked it up, counted it with theatrical slowness, and dropped it in the trash can by her chair. "Corruption requires subtlety you don't have yet," she said. "Now tell me what you'd actually do if a 4-year-old came into your ear seizing and nobody was available but you." Something in him cracked open by the second week, not all at once but in pieces the way ice gives before it breaks. He started asking real questions. He started showing up to their sessions already having read what she'd assigned. The arrogance didn't vanish, but it thinned, revealing underneath it a sharp, anxious kid who had spent his whole life being protected from consequences he secretly suspected he deserved. Roman was a different problem entirely. He didn't hover, but he was a constant presence at the edges of the house, in the doorway with a glass of something amber-colored, watching her with Caleb across the room with an unreadable expression, in the kitchen at odd hours when she stayed too late. Once, memorably, teaching his son to throw a punch correctly in the gym off the east wing while Juniper pretended not to watch through the glass. Every conversation between them carried a current she didn't have a name for and didn't trust herself to examine. It happened on a Thursday in late October, the rain coming down hard against the tall windows of the study. Caleb had finally produced an essay that didn't read like a hostage negotiation and had gone up to bed exhausted and, for the first time, almost proud of himself. Juniper stayed behind to pack her bag. "You're doing something I didn't think was possible," Roman said from the doorway, his jacket gone, sleeves rolled to the forearm, looking tired in a way she hadn't seen on him before. "He's doing it. I just keep handing him the shovel." He crossed the room slowly, stopping close enough that she had to tip her head back to hold his eyes. "I think we've spent enough nights in these trenches to drop the formalities. Roman." "Mr. Sterling is safer," she said, but it came out softer than she meant it to. "Safer isn't the same as true." His knuckles brushed a strand of hair back from her face, and the casual heat of it went straight through her. "This house has not been quiet in years, Juniper. You walked in and somehow made it quiet." She knew distantly that she should step back, that she was a civilian, an employee, a woman with student loans and a studio apartment, and absolutely no business standing this close to a man who kept armed men in his hallway. But the rules felt very far away in that room, and she let herself lean, just slightly, into his hand. The doors slammed open before either of them could decide what came next. A man she recognized as the head of Roman's security stood drenched in the doorway, face bloodless. "Boss, the Andros shipment got hit at the South Terminal an hour ago, and we just got word. They know about her." Roman's whole posture changed in the space of a breath, the tired, open man gone, replaced by something carved from stone. "Get Caleb to the safe room, now." He turned, already pulling Juniper toward the hidden elevator behind the library shelves, his voice low and absolute. "The Andros family has wanted my terminals for 2 years. They think taking you gets them my full attention. I'm a nurse," she said, the words thin with panic as the elevator doors closed. "I'm nobody. You're not nobody to me." He drew a gun from beneath his jacket with a calm, terrible efficiency that told her exactly how many times he'd done this before. "And they are about to learn what that costs." They didn't stay at the house. Roman knew a fixed location was a coffin waiting to close, so he put her in the back of an armored Range Rover with Caleb already strapped in beside her, pale but steady, and a driver named Felix who took the gravel drive at a speed that made the tires scream. They didn't make it to the highway. 2 trucks came out of the dark from a service road, headlights blinding, and slammed into the Rover's flank with a shriek of metal that threw Juniper hard against Roman's shoulder. He had his arm around her before she'd even registered the impact, shielding her as the windshield spider-webbed under the first volley of gunfire. "Stay down," he ordered, and then he was out of the vehicle, using the open door as cover, returning fire with the same chilling precision he'd shown loading the weapon. Juniper crouched on the floor of the Rover with her hands over her head, every nurse's instinct in her screaming to do something useful and finding nothing she could do. Beside her, Caleb had gone rigid. Not frozen, she realized, but thinking, his eyes fixed on something past the chaos. "They're not actually trying to hit the car," he said suddenly, voice shaking but clear. "Look at the spread pattern. They're herding us toward the drainage culvert. It's a choke point." He had his phone out, thumb flying. "Dad taught me the old terminal maps. I'm pulling up the response unit on the North Channel. They can flank from the culvert side in 90 seconds if someone calls it in right now." "Do it!" Roman barked without turning, and Caleb did, voice steady in a way Juniper had never once heard from him in their sessions. 90 seconds later, headlights tore around the bend from an angle no one had been watching, and a second armored truck plowed directly into the lead attacker's vehicle. Men spilled out, and within a minute the gunfire had collapsed into the ragged sound of a fight already lost. Roman lowered his weapon only when the last of his own men gave the signal, then turned back to the rover, breathing hard, eyes finding Juniper first and then his son. "You called that in," he said to Caleb, something raw moving across his face. "You read the terrain." "Juniper taught me to look for what's actually happening instead of what people want me to see," Caleb said, and for the first time since she'd met him, he didn't look like a boy hiding behind his father's name. He looked like someone capable of carrying it. Roman gave him a single nod, heavy with everything he didn't have words for, then crossed to where Juniper had climbed shakily out of the wreck, rain soaking through her scrubs, glass glittering in her hair. This was the moment, she understood distantly, where she was supposed to ask to go home, to put in for a transfer to another state and never look at a black SUV again. "I can have you on a flight by morning," Roman said quietly, gun still loose in his hand, eyes searching her face like he expected her to already be gone. "New name, new city, funded for the rest of your life. You never have to see any of this again." Juniper looked past him at Caleb, soaked and shaking and more alive than she'd ever seen him, directing two of the security team toward the wounded driver with a calm authority that hadn't existed in him a month ago. Then she looked at Roman, rain running down the hard lines of his face, and she thought of the study, and the quiet, and the way he'd looked at her like she was the only steady thing in a life built entirely on threat. She closed the distance between them instead. "I don't transfer out on my patients," she said, her hand finding his jaw. "And I don't run from the people I'm responsible for keeping safe." He made a sound low in his throat that wasn't quite a word, and then his arms were around her, pulling her in out of the rain, and he kissed her like a man who had spent 20 years expecting to die alone, and had only just understood he might not have to. 6 months later, the lights of the pediatric ward hummed the same as they always had, and Juniper sat at the nurse's station, finishing a chart with nothing more dramatic in it than a successfully treated ear infection. Caleb came through the double doors in scrubs of his own, a visitor badge for the volunteer EMT program clipped to his collar, a stethoscope around his neck that he was finally, genuinely earning the right to wear. "Got my acceptance letter to the accelerated program," he said, setting a coffee down on her desk without being asked. "Early admission. I leave for training in the fall. You earned every bit of it," she said, and meant it. "Yeah." He hesitated at the door, the old smirk softened into something more honest. "Thanks, Juniper, for not letting me sit in that waiting room." She watched him go, then walked to the window at the end of the hall. Down in the lot, parked crookedly across 2 visitor spaces, because he had never once in his life worried about a ticket, was a black SUV, and leaning against it in a grey suit with his tie already loosened, was Roman Sterling, watching the doors with the particular patience of a man who had learned, finally, what it meant to wait his turn. Juniper smiled, gathered her bag, and walked out to meet him, and for the first time in either of their lives, the world outside those doors felt entirely, quietly safe.